In the studio from Creation Ministries International. Good morning, Dr. John.
Yeah, good morning, Mick.
It's good to have you here again this morning, Dr. John. Of course, Creation Ministries have their own website, creation.com, where you can go to get all sorts of questions answered. Or, of course, you can send those questions through to Dr. John. Our text line is 0401 949 949. Now, over the last couple of weeks, we've been speaking about the age of the Earth. We've been looking at Uluru and a few different fossils, that sort of thing. And, Dr. John, I've got to ask right up front, in the news this week, there was a headline in miragenews.com, Fossil Discoveries Reveal Cause of Megafauna Extinction. Now, they've found some fossils in Australia. That's paleontologists found them up near Mackay, and apparently these fossils were, really big animals like giant kangaroo type things, well, some sort of dinosaurs. And the research team, this is what it says in the article, the research team concluded that extreme environmental change was the most likely cause of the megafauna's extinction, and that humans alone could not be blamed. What do you think that environmental change could have been?
I think it's probably what we've been talking about for quite a while, Mick. We think the greatest environmental change that the world has ever seen was Noah's flood. And, of course, that's the sort of thing that we are going to be talking about again this morning, because we're continuing on the theme that we've been covering the last few weeks, and that is the age of the Earth. Mm-hmm. And we got that question prompted by a question about Uluru, about Ayers Rock. Mm-hmm. And we've been talking about how most people would look at Ayers Rock and they'd think it was just this great big boulder sitting out there in the desert. And you wouldn't realise from just looking at it that it's actually the tip of a huge amount of sedimentary rock that extends an enormous distance under the ground. And you wouldn't also pick as well that it's actually standing on its end, because Ayers Rock is not just a big boulder, it is layered sedimentary rock, and the sedimentary layers are vertical. Mm. And there's an enormous amount of that sort of sedimentary rock out there in the middle of Australia. If you go a few kilometres away to the Olgas, you find the same sort of rock, but the layers are horizontal in the Olgas, whereas they're vertical in Uluru.
Well, I've often heard, Dr. John, that, when you see those vertical layers, they say that tectonic plates have pushed together and they've pushed mountains up. But in this case, it's just one single rock, a giant rock, but one rock. So obviously it can't be tectonic plates, or else there'd be lots of it, but there's just one. It's the sort of thing that you'd expect to happen to a rock in a pond where a whole lot of water was pushing on it, right?
Well, that's the one we can see. There might be a lot more under the ground that hasn't come up as well that we can't see. We don't really know about that because there is a lot out there in central Australia. But you're quite right. But you see, the Bible actually tells us what happened at the end of Noah's flood, and of course that's the greatest catastrophe, the greatest catastrophic bit of climate change the world's ever seen. Mm. And it tells us that at the end of the flood, the mountains got pushed up and the valleys sank down and the water ran off. And there's a lot of evidence for that out there in the middle of Australia, and Ayers Rock would have been pushed up in that time of mountain building that came at the end of the flood. And what we have to realise, of course, is that the true age of the Earth is nowhere near what we keep hearing about, because the Bible tells us that the Earth was created only about 6,000 years ago, but that after the entry of sin into the world, it became very, very corrupt, and God had to destroy it. And he destroyed it with Noah's flood, and that was only about 4,500 years ago. Mm-hmm. So that's the maximum time that we can have for any structure that we find in our present Earth, the one that we stand on. And that will include Ayers Rock, Uluru. And the world really, the only survivors on the land, the people and the animals, were those who were in the ark with Noah. And the people who were in the ark, they survived and they multiplied over the next 5 generations. They all spoke the same language. They were all able to intermarry. And they only dispersed across the globe from the Middle East when God confused their languages at Babel. And if we calculate the time that happened, that was only about 4,200 years ago. So what that means is that all cultures and ethnic groups across the whole globe are very closely related because of that intermarriage, and their histories only go back that far. Now, even when you look at what the secular world believes about the early cultures like the Egyptians and the Sumerians and the Mayans and the Aztecs and so on, and written language, it only goes back about 4,000 or 5,000 years as far as the world is concerned. So it's all very consistent with the time frame that the Bible has.
Yes, yes. The way they measure the dates, and obviously we've talked about that, how there's no particular instrument to measure dates. It's interesting how they keep coming up with new dates. I've got a couple of stories to put together that we'll talk about shortly. You are on 94.9. We've got Dr. John on the line from Creation Ministries International. Send your questions through now. Send them to our text line 0401 949 949. And earlier, a fossil that came from up near Mackay, I believe, in Australia. It's like this giant kangaroo-looking thing, and it was dated about 40,000 years ago. When I say dated, they whacked a date on it. And there was another story in the Science News, and they've got a headline here, New Dinosaur Unearthed in Australia. Different story. This was about a dinosaur found in Victoria that looks extremely similar to the other one that was dated at 40,000 years. But this one is just a couple of years older, 110 million years. Yeah. I wondered, Dr. John, how's there such a gigantic, huge discrepancy in two fossils that look so similar? It
is amazing, isn't it, Mick, the sort of figures that they come out with. You know, there is a range of 40,000 on the one hand and 110 million on the other. I mean, there is an enormous difference in that. And the truth, of course, is that if the Bible's history is correct, then all those multiple millions and billions of years, they are mythical. They don't exist. They never have occurred in the history of the world. And I was going to talk a little bit about another aspect of those dates, because remember we said that human history only goes back, well, the history of the world is only going to go back a little over 4,000 years. Now, of course, there are lots of ethnic groups and civilizations that are dated at older than that. And remember last week we talked about a place called Mungo Lake out in outback Western New South Wales.
Yep.
And about 50 years ago, there were a couple of fossils found there. They were actually Aboriginal burials. And they called them Mungo Man and Mungo Woman.
Yes.
And when they found them originally, they dated them at about 19 or 20,000 years. But then they decided that they would date a few other things and try a few different radioactive techniques, and they came up with a date of 40,000 and then 60,000, and all of these dates are found by various indirect techniques that they use. There's no direct way, as you mentioned before, of measuring a date. There's no instrument that will measure a date. You have to do it by all of these indirect techniques. Anyway, the upshot of it all was they eventually settled on Mungo Man and Mungo Woman being about 50,000 years old. And that, of course, is why it's claimed that Indigenous Australians have been in this country that long. We need to remember that that date of 50,000 years did not come from the Aboriginal people themselves. They didn't keep a calendar. That date has come from the very, very unreliable dating techniques that the white man has put on them. And biblically speaking, of course, the maximum time that Indigenous Australians could have been here is about 4,000 years. And, you know, there are a few mathematical techniques that you can apply to the numbers of Aboriginal people, and you find that it matches up very, very well with a date of a little bit less than 4,000 years. Certainly nothing like 50,000. That is mathematically an impossibility.
Yep.
Now, of course, 4,000 years is still a very long time. And without any question, they are the original inhabitants of this country. And just like the other First Nations groups that settled in North and Central and South America, you know, they definitely were the first people here. Now, you can't necessarily say that for some of our neighbours, of course, over in New Zealand and the Pacific Islands, because they probably displaced the original indigenous groups that were there, and they wouldn't claim that they are the original inhabitants, even though their local history goes back a fair way.
Mm-hmm.
But look, worldwide, you know, it's been the same ever since time. When we say time immemorial, we mean time of about 4,000 years, because we've had wars and conflicts throughout history ever since people dispersed from Babel. And all the different ethnic groups have striven through their lust and their greed for more power and more influence, and people have gone out trying to conquer their neighbours ever since the dispersion from Babel. And all of that lust for power and greed is the consequence of sin, and the author of sin, of course, is the devil.
Yeah.
And everywhere you go, you find the same. And those First Nations cultures, they've been terribly damaged. If you look at what happened in North America with the Native Americans, look at the damage that was done by the white man coming to North America. If you look at Central and South America, look at the terrible damage that was done to the Aztecs and the Mayans by the Spaniards and the Portuguese. And of course, here we have the same sort of history in Australia ever since the British arrived here in 1788. Yeah. So really, the history of oppression of indigenous people right throughout the world is very, very extensive. And it's quite a blight on the history of our nation as well as other nations right throughout the world.
Yes, absolutely. Wow. Dr. John, it is 25 minutes past 8. That was really interesting. We're going to come back after the news and weather. If you do have any questions for Dr. John, please send them through to the text line 0401 949 949. You are on 94.9 this morning. It is 26 minutes past 9, and we're with Dr. John from Creation Ministries International. He's been speaking about oppression of Indigenous peoples. And look, I Googled it just to see if there's been any news articles on oppression of Indigenous peoples. Dr. John, there's only 86,000 results.
Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me, Mick, because really some of the things that have happened, not just in this country but right throughout the world, have been really terrible. And thankfully, a lot of those dreadful things are in the process of being rectified. But you can't change history. You know, the tragedies of history are there. There's nothing we can do about them now except acknowledge the truth of what did happen, and then work towards overcoming it. Yeah. And of course, it was the devil and man's sin that really was the ultimate cause. But when you look at it, you know, you can see how God has been at work and how his plan of salvation has been unfolding right throughout history, despite the wickedness of man. And if you even go back to the early days of the church, Satan's persecution of the early church, what happened then is that saw the gospel sent right throughout the Roman Empire, probably even got as far as India through the Apostle Thomas. So it was very, very widespread in that first century. Mm. And it's probable that some British hostages in Rome in that first century, then took the gospel back to Britain, and a few centuries later, the Irish were pirates and raiders, and they raided England and they captured Patrick, and they took him back to Ireland. And he eventually escaped, but the Holy Spirit sent him back there. And of course, we know what happened then. Patrick then converted the whole of Ireland, and so they now reap the benefit of Christianity being brought to them by somebody who their own wickedness had originally captured. So there's a lot of interesting things like that in history. And when you think of the marauding bands of Vikings and Germanic raiders that came down and conquered Europe and Britain and so on, what happened was that brought them into contact with Christianity. Yeah. And they then became Christianized, which wouldn't have happened if they hadn't done what they had done, motivated really by the devil.
Yeah.
And that's how the gospel got to North and Central and South America. The Europeans went over there, and even though they didn't have very good intentions for the indigenous people, what happened was that the indigenous people learnt about Jesus through that. So God's been at work, even though the devil has been very active as well. And we have to face the fact that despite the terrible things that were done in Australia, the British in 1788 brought the gospel here. So the Aboriginal people in Australia have something at least to be grateful for what they look at as a terrible blight on their history, but it did bring a blessing as well. And so many of them have found Jesus because of what happened back there in the late 18th century. So it hasn't always been bad.
Yeah.
You know, Jesus said the gospel was to be taken to the ends of the earth, and it actually has been preached everywhere. And what we now have to look forward to is his soon return. And all the ethnic groups throughout the world, including our own Aboriginal people, have reason to be grateful despite the oppression that their forefathers suffered. God is always going to have the final say.
Yeah. It's interesting that, so many stories that come from the dream time with the Aboriginals and so many other Indigenous groups around the world having stories that seem to fit in with the Old Testament, almost like the Jews had the Old Testament. And then it all started with Jesus, the spread of the New Testament and the understanding of who Jesus was. It was probably easier for the Indigenous people to accept Jesus in that, or accept the Bible in that, so much of the Old Testament did actually line up with some of their Dreamtime stories. Do you think that's the case?
Oh, that's absolutely true. And we're all over the world, wherever Indigenous people never had any contact with missionaries, never heard anything about the Bible, they certainly had in their, as you say, the dream time for the Aboriginal people and a lot of the legends in the Pacific Islands and other places throughout the world. They all had a story about a great flood and of a favoured family of people who were saved in that flood, along with animals. They'd never heard about the Bible, they'd never heard of the story of Genesis, but they still knew that story. And a lot of them responded to it because it fitted in with what their own culture had taught them.
Yeah, absolutely. It is 19 minutes to 9. You're on 94.9. We will be back with Dr. John very shortly. It's to 9, and we have Dr. John from Creation Ministries International on the line. He's answering your questions. Simply send them through to our text line, 0401 949 949. And we're also talking about recent news, stuff that's come out over the last couple of weeks. And Dr. John it's not just in theconversation.com, it was in many, many publications over the last couple of weeks, stories about prehistoric human footprints. And prehistoric, it's interesting how they sort of put these words into the headlines, and they talk about, ancient group behaviour. I found the story particularly interesting because at one point in the story, this is these footprints in northern Tanzania, that they talk about how they have very little information about the people, who they were or what they did. But then there's a whole lot of paragraphs talking about who they probably were and what they probably did. And they make up this awesome story about something that they've just said they have no idea about.
Yeah, look, it is amazing. It was a great article, of course, because what they found was a whole lot of human footprints in volcanic mud there in Tanzania. And they had to make up a story because lots of the footprints were going in different directions. And they decided that one group was females foraging for food, because apparently some ethnic groups in the local area do that to this day.
Mm-hmm.
But what I found very interesting, apart from the stories that they made up about it, was the time frame, because they felt that the age of them was somewhere between about 5,000 years and 19,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, 5,000 years puts it very much in the ballpark of what happened during Noah's flood, because the flood was not just rain. It was volcanic and tectonic upheaval as well. And you would have had people really struggling to get out of what was coming and running around in all directions. And that's much more likely to be the story of what happened here. Yeah. And, of course, the other thing that's interesting about those footprints, it's a bit like footprints now. If you go walking along the beach and you leave your footprints on the beach, they don't last very long. They get washed away by the next wave that comes in.
Mm-hmm.
So, but if you leave them in wet concrete, within an hour or a day, they're nice and solid. Mm-hmm. And that's the sort of thing that must have happened here. It can't have happened over a huge amount of time. It's got to be minutes or hours, or at the most a day. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been preserved. But I found the interesting thing about these ones was that they gave that date of thousands of years, and yet in similar footprints in similar volcanic ash elsewhere in Tanzania, they gave a date of 3.7 million years for similar footprints. Now, there's a bit of a difference between 5,000 and 3.7 million. And then not too far away in Kenya, they found similar ones, and they gave them a date of 1.5 million. Now, that is an enormous date range, isn't it? 5,000, 1.5 million, 3.7 million. And as we've mentioned many times with those dates, they're really just plucked out of the air. There is no way of measuring those dates. They are just really figments of the imagination of the discoverers. And what we really need to realise as Christians, that the only dates that are true are the ones that we find in the Bible. The Bible's history of the world is the true history, and human history only goes back about 4,500 years. So these footprints can't be any older than that.
I find it intriguing that they say millions of years, considering they are quite literally on the surface. They're up on top. We have a pelican statue at the entrance, which is made out of concrete. And it's been there for, tens of years now. And this thing has eroded and worn away. Now, this is concrete made by man to be, some of the strongest rock that's possibly made. And, we're looking at replacing Percy the pelican, the statue, because it's just so worn over tens of years. So, honestly, how do these footprints stay unworn? And I've seen the photos. They look like they were put there yesterday. How do they stay unworn like that for millions of years? I mean, it's not even hundreds or thousands. The dates are just so ridiculous.
Well, that's right. And when you think about it, the concrete that we make is scientifically evaluated to be proper concrete that will set rapidly and stay strong for a long time. And here we have footprints that have occurred naturally in volcanic mud, and that must have been just had the right composition to harden. And as you say, how could it last millions of years?
Yeah, absolutely. You are on 94.9 this morning. It is 10 to 9. We'll be back with Dr. John shortly. Send your questions through 0401 949 949. That's talking about footprints that were found in Tanzania. I said Tanzania earlier. Tanzania. They've dated them as either thousands of years old, or they're saying there were footprints around there at 3.66 million years old. Sounds crazy. We're talking about Percy the Pelican statue at the entrance, which is only tens of years old, and it's all worn out. Interesting. Very interesting, Dr. John.
Yes, look, Mick, and I mean, it might sound that like we're constantly criticising secular science, but we're not really doing that. What we are doing, we are in the business of defending biblical history. And when the explanations of secular science contradict that history, then we really do have to call out those explanations, because we also want to point out how they don't stand up to scrutiny, because this is an important issue, and the eternal destiny of millions of people really is what's at stake here. We know that the long-age evolutionary world history is a major stumbling block for millions of people who won't even consider the Bible, because they've put their faith in that very, very fallible science. And long-age evolutionary teaching, it's nothing more than opinion. It's not fact. And we can show that in many ways it is fatally flawed. And there are numerous scientific examples that we can bring up to show that. Now, there is no other way back to a relationship with God except through Jesus. And our task on earth is to get that relationship re-established, because without that, there's no salvation. And if there's any stumbling blocks to that reconciliation, then we need to expose them and try and get them out of the way. Because once people have departed this earth, it's too late. We have to be submitted to God this side of the grave, so that we're going to be sharing in His new earth and His new heavens that He's going to create, and Jesus is going to be the ruler of those new heavens and new earth. We can't afford to leave it too late. We need to receive Him as Saviour and Lord now. So that's really what we're on about at Creation Ministries. We want to show that biblical history is the true history, and don't be distracted or turned away from it by the supposedly assured results of modern science.
Absolutely. Oh, Dr. John, thank you so much again. And look, if anybody does have any questions in regards to true history, or in regards to something you may have seen on TV, or something that has sort of bent your mind a little bit, you don't understand, let us know what your questions are, because Dr. John can answer them, and there's probably a lot of other people out there with very similar questions. Send your questions through to 0401 949 949, and we can talk about them next week. That number again, 0401 949 949. Thank you so much again, Dr. John. An awesome morning.
Yeah, thank you, Mick, and we'll see you again next week.
Look forward to it. It is 3 minutes to 9. You're on 94.9 this morning. Good morning.